Howdy and welcome. My name is Aldo Leopold. I'm with the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute, and it's a pleasure to be here this morning at Bamberger Ranch as part of our Leopold Live series. Leopold Live is a virtual field day where we review and illustrate the application of Aldo Leopold's 5 tools. Aldo Leopold was the father of wildlife management, and he described how 5 tools, the axe, cow, plow, fire and gun, can be used in the creative restoration of wildlife habitat benefiting wildlife populations. And so Leopold Live goes through these 5 tools and tells landowners, natural resource practitioners, ways of applying those tools in a way that again can benefit wildlife. And so with that, I would like to introduce my colleague and friend, Dr. April Sampson. April is the executive director of Bamberger, and she's going to tell us a little bit about Bamberger and kick us off for this morning.
Thank you so much, Roel. I'm so pleased that we are working together on this wonderful series. We've really enjoyed partnering with the Natural Resources Institute. I'd like to welcome everyone virtually to the Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. We are a 501c3 nonprofit organization whose mission is to teach ethical land stewardship through education and outreach. We have many years of experience of good, sound wildlife management, as well as innovative ecological restoration. We've practiced that for many decades. We're very proud of that history.
So in essence, April, we're in Leopold's living room here at Bamberger.
That's exactly right, Roel. We sure are. Leopold's living room is a great way to describe here where we are today. Today we are going to be discussing one of the 5 tools that Roel already mentioned, and which is the gun. We're going to be talking about using the gun as well as other tools that act in the same way as the gun as part of a manager's toolbox of important tools for habitat management. I'd like to take this opportunity to really thank our panel of expert commentators who are helping us with questions over Facebook Live. Those commentators are Romy Swanson, Dr. John Tomachek, Andy James, and Amanda Gobelli. And I'm sorry, Amanda, if I mispronounced your name. Thank you very much for being here today. I am also very pleased to have the pleasure to introduce our expert who's joined us today for our discussion of Leopold's tool, the gun. And so I have the great pleasure of saying that Mike Kruger is with us today. He's a retired wildlife biologist from the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And so without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Mike. Thank you for being here, Mike.
Thank you, Roel, and thank you, April. And it's a pleasure being here, and more so than just Leopold's living room. We're looking at Leopold's backyard on this glorious fall day in October in Texas Hill Country. Beautiful. I think a lot of what we're seeing is still part of the Selah Bamberger Ranch too. So, we're looking at some good habitat management. I'd like to introduce and thank Steve Fulton, who's the ranch manager here at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. I've looked up to Steve for many years now, literally had to look up at you. But I'm glad they put me on a little bit of an incline so we can kind of speak more eye-to-eye level. So it's good to be sharing the stage, or letting me share the stage with you, Steve. I'm going to elaborate a little bit about my career. I spent 27 years with Texas Parks and Wildlife. I retired in 2012, so it's been 8 years this month. But I started in East Texas, moved to Lampasas, just up the road, and then I finished my career as the district biologist for the Edwards Plateau in Kerrville. Most of my career was spent working with, it was in the wildlife division, and it was working with private landowners as a technical guidance biologist. So it was my privilege to meet many landowners throughout Central Texas and early in my career in East Texas too. I also had a distinct pleasure of when I was working during my tenure, it overlapped the tenure of Andy Sampson too as executive director, April's dad Andy. So it was a real privilege to work under Andy's leadership, doing many parts of that 27-year history there at Parks and Wildlife. I'm going to start by saying that, with these 5 tools, you really don't want to look at each one individually. They all kind of work together. Good property is going to mesh all these. Steve said it in a good way last week during the plow segment, where he said, and Larry Redden was talking about the bulldozer, and Steve made the comment that you can use a bulldozer to remove unwanted brush. It's similar to the axe, but also that bulldozer is disturbing the ground like a plow. So one tool can be used for several purposes. So all of these tools mesh together. So today, I think what we can best do is make that relationship between livestock in these tools here. For livestock managing, as a land manager, you have the ability to capture livestock, put them in a corral, haul them off if you need to reduce grazing pressure. Conversely, you can add more cows if you need to increase grazing pressure in the years when you have a lot of vegetation. Livestock are relatively easy to confine with I've seen some pretty sorry fences in central Texas that can hold livestock. You don't need anything real fancy. You cannot say the same thing about our native wildlife like white-tailed deer. You just cannot capture them, at least legally, except with some very specific permits. Exotics that are common in this part of the world, you all have some exotics here. You just cannot manage the browsing and grazing pressure that these native and non-native wild animals, these big herbivores, these big ungulates are making on the habitat. You don't have the ability easy enough to capture and move them off the property. So we're going to use a harvest tool, and these tools here that Steve is going to describe to be able to manage the grazing pressure or browsing pressure on a piece of property. Parks and Wildlife role in that whole process is, as a state agency, our job, the Wildlife Division, is to establish bag limits for game species, season lengths for opening and closing dates, as well as the means and methods for the take of those species, those game species. And it's just not, large herbivores, big game, but also small game. When we come to migratory birds, doves, and waterfowl, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has a lot of input, more input than the state agency, but we work hand in hand. And I apologize for saying me. I still feel like I'm part of the agency. But so what the Parks and Wildlife does is they have to collect data frequently, periodically, to justify those seasons and bag limits, and to some extent means and methods. So they've got to count animals. Parks and Wildlife biologists spend a lot of time every year counting animals, whether it's deer or quail or trying to count turkeys. Also monitor non-game species. Collect harvest data, weights and antler measurements and things like that. But all this is done to justify where one county will have a 5-deer bag limit and another county may only have a 3-deer bag limit with a very restrictive doe harvest ability or an antler restriction, like a 13-inch antler restriction. So that's the role of Parks and Wildlife in this whole process. So if you're a hunter, whether you're a new hunter or you've been hunting all of your life, it behooves you every year to refer to what's called the Outdoor Annual that Parks and Wildlife publishes. The hunting season starts on September 1 annually and goes through August 31st. So by usually mid-August, early August, when the licenses first become available for sale, these outdoor annuals are available across the counter at sporting goods stores. There's also a online app that you can go to Parks and Wildlife, as well as an app you can put on your phone. But again, you want to refer to this, and just to refresh your memory for the counties that you're hunting in, what the bag limits are. But also, if something has changed, there's usually a section at the beginning of these outdoor annuals that have things that are new this year or something like that. In case there's been a change in regulation, you surely want to be aware of that and not get yourself in trouble. But like I said, a big part of our job is that means and methods. So I'm going to turn it over to Steve, and he's going to talk about some of the means and methods used to manage populations of wild ungulates, wild herbivores. So, Steve?
Well, thanks, Mike, and thanks again for coming out to the ranch and sharing your expertise with us today.
You're welcome.
It's very much appreciated. Before I talk about the individual tools that we use to harvest populations, why do we harvest populations? It's not just to fill our freezer. If you look back to the late 19th century and all the way through the mid 20th century, wild game were overexploited, and especially in the case of your large predators, like your red wolves and your mountain lions. These were persecuted just because of their predation on livestock. So those large predators were taken to the point of extinction, or very today where they're very rare to find in the case of a mountain lion. So without those large predators that can help us control these large herbivore populations, in the case of white-tailed deer, if you have too many of them, they will actually destroy their own habitat, their own food resources, and in so doing, they'll have very negative impacts on our other wildlife species, game and non-game alike. So it falls on us as managers to help control those populations where maybe those large predators were doing that perfectly well in the past. So the tools that we most commonly use to help us with the management of those populations are laid out here on this table. The very most common would be a hunting rifle, which is what you see here. Just a simple bolt-action rifle, caliber in .243 common caliber. With the advent of rifle scopes, this telescopic sight, it really helps us be more accurate and efficient at harvesting those animals. Now, also Texas Parks and Wildlife, for many years has allowed archery equipment to be used as a legal means of harvesting white-tailed deer and other deer, like the mule deer, and for the state of Texas, it actually gives you an extra month to hunt those animals. Normally, the month of October is set aside for just archery, the use of archery equipment to harvest those animals. So what Mike is holding here is a compound bow. Again, it can be a very efficient tool of harvesting animals. It does have some more challenges versus a rifle, where you have to get much closer to the game to be efficient. Also on the table here, which was legalized as archery equipment, as a legal means of harvesting white-tailed deer and other deer a few years ago, is a crossbow, and it's a little more easier to harvest those animals, again, because you have a telescopic lens, so you can be more accurate and more efficient. But not just the use of these animals to manage these herbivore populations helps out wildlife. Mike's going to explain to us how just purchasing these items can actually help with wildlife conservation.
Before I do that, I'm glad you brought up the over exploitation of wildlife. And like you said, in the late 19th century, early 20th century, we had market hunting. We didn't have very many regulations. And so there were things like punt guns, I think they call them, where the market hunters could take one shot and kill 100 ducks at one time for the market. So that's the following Leopold's adage, that same tool that at one time could destroy, almost take populations to an extinct level, are now being used to maintain healthy populations. So that's a good part of, or a good demonstration of the good and the bad of the same tool being applied. But like Steve said, one of the most important concepts of using these is safety, safety, safety. Safety to yourself and to anyone around you, because these are all lethal weapons that have the ability to cause severe bodily injury to a person. So that brings me to the point of a very important, probably I'd argue one of the most important laws, federal legislation ever passed in the United States, called the Federal Aid and Wildlife Restoration Act, 1937, also called the Pittman-Robertson Act, or PR Act, named after the two authors of that bill. But what that legislation does, it puts an excise tax, 11% excise tax on sporting arms, which is rifles and shotguns, that same tax on ammunition for those weapons, as well as that same tax on archery equipment. In addition, there's a 10% tax on the sale of handguns. So all of this money that's generated from the sale of these tools that hunters use is collected by the Fish and Wildlife Service, a federal agency, and it's doled out to the state agencies for the purpose of wildlife management. And we'll get into some of the other uses of those funds, but the primary use is to fund state wildlife agencies, to pay for personnel, to pay for equipment, to manage the wildlife populations in that state. It also goes to law enforcement. Law enforcement gets PR funds. But even if you're in, the way that system works is for every dollar that a state agency pays on eligible projects, they can get reimbursed 75 cents for each dollar that is spent. That 25% match comes from the sale, most of it comes from the sale of hunting licenses in that state. So really, hunting is very much a user-funded program. The hunters are generating the dollars that helps promote their sport and provide healthy wildlife populations. Another big important aspect of it is that half of the funds, taxes raised from the sale of handguns and archery equipment is used for hunter education programs in the state, as well as for paying or establishing public shooting ranges too. So that's where that safety aspect comes in. All these states have a very, let's say, well-run program for hunter education.
I'm glad you brought up hunter education. It is a requirement for hunters that were born after September 2nd, 1971, to have and maintain a hunter education certificate. So whether it's via an online course or an instructor-led course, you have to have that hunter's education certificate. And during that course, you will learn all the proper handling of firearms, like you see here before you today, and also how to be safe when you're outside enjoying the outdoor experiences that we love to have.
Yeah.
So.
Ethics too, they teach you a lot about
Absolutely.
ethics, not to wear that big long Bowie knife in the cafe and covered with blood, all those kind of things to be sure that hunting has a good look to it.
All right. Now to help us cover another tool that we use to manage populations here on the ranch, a specific population here on the ranch, our staff biologist Jared Holmes is standing right next door. Go ahead and take it away, Jared.
Well, thank you, Stephen. As you can see, I am here in front of another one of Leopold's tools, another iteration of the gun, if you will, a hog trap. And before I talk about hog trapping and traps in general, what we're doing when we're talking about Leopold's tool of the gun, we're talking about regulating biomass. And biomass is the total number of energy in an ecosystem. You can also look at as the total number of mouths in that ecosystem. And it starts with your primary producers, and then it goes all the way up your trophic levels. And to kind of go back to what Stephen was talking about is, we have removed the regulation. By taking the top of that trophic pyramid out, our apex predators, we have allowed everything to get unbalanced. So just like Leopold says, the cowman can pull down the range with too many mouths, so can the mountain die by the same way. Too many mouths on the mountain, too many deer, can pull the mountain down. So we have to be, as land managers and land stewards, we are now the regulation. And trapping is a really good way to help with that, especially when you're talking about what we built this trap for, feral hogs. Feral hogs are devastating for your ecosystem. Not only do they wreak havoc on your ground nesting birds like quail and turkey, but they also decimate your small mammal populations. They can even eat fawns, but most importantly, they destroy your reptiles and amphibians, okay? So when we're talking about hogs specifically, we have to take 60% of the population just to maintain that year's population. So if you're a ranch owner and you have 100 pigs on your property, you have to take 60 every year. You would basically be sitting at a hunting blind 24/7 to try to accomplish that. And traps such as this really help you put a dent in that population a lot quicker. Year to date here on the ranch, we have taken 166 feral hogs by trapping or by hunting, and the occasional walk with our dog leads to some little piglets becoming some dog food. But the important thing with this, again, is that regulating biomass. So you as a landowner, you're now thinking, well, what do I do? I've got these pigs in a trap. What do I do? Well, the Texas Animal Health Commission has some great pamphlets that you can talk about with that. They have rules and regulations about moving these animals via the wheel, truck, or trailer. And they also, AgriLife Extension has some great ways of mitigating some of the hog damage. You can see they have plowed up this field, and that is not the iteration of the plow that we want for Leopold here. But the most important thing you can do for your land is to sustain it by hunting, by managing, by trapping. Those 166 hogs here on the ranch, they all went into my belly and Stephen's belly. We are what I like to call venivores. We eat the stuff that comes here from the ranch. And the meat allows you to kind of judge how you're doing as a land steward as well. Hogs that are harvested in the late summer, especially the little boar hogs and sows, have a sweet taste to them because you can taste the mulberry and the persimmon and the cactus that they're eating. So my favorite animal here on the ranch to eat would be the Sika deer or the Sika elk, whatever you want to call it, Cervus nippon. And they have a really dark, rich, purplish red meat. And you can really taste the iron, which means you're tasting how productive your soil are because they're grazers and they're browsers. So it's really this field to table ethic that we maintain here on the ranch to feed ourselves and feed our body. Now, in this Dutch oven, you see, we've got some carnitas that have been cooking. Now, Dr. Cathy's probably got the best job. He gets to eat the fruit of this labor with that, and we can do an entire Leopold Live just on trapping hogs and hog management and wild game cookery too. And if I was cooking something like white-tailed deer, I would have to know a little bit more because management goes out the issue when you're talking about harvest quota for feral hogs and invasive species like axis deer and even Sika. But if this was white-tailed deer, we have to think a little bit more about management here on the ranch and you as a landowner. And for that, I'm going to kick it back to Mike and Stephen.
Thank you, Jared, and a good kick. And I just want to reaffirm that what Jared said about Texas Animal Health Commission is the one that regulates the feral hogs. It being a non-native species like feral hogs, exotics such as axis deer, fallow deer, they do not fall under the jurisdiction of Texas Parks and Wildlife. But other than the fact that you do need a hunting license in most cases to pursue those animals, there's some exemptions when it comes to feral hogs. But Jared is right. You know, he talked about 60% of the population, but as far as I know, there's never been a good way established to count feral hogs. But something like white-tailed deer and some species of exotics, quail, turkey, there are some very well-established census techniques where you, as the land manager, can use those census techniques to determine what your inventory is, and then prior to hunting season, in most cases, so that you know what appropriate harvest would be for those species there. So here in Central Texas, for counting deer specifically, a very specific technique is the spotlight census technique, and just an example. But just want to caution, just don't go out and start shining lights all over the ranch at night, because there are techniques involved. It's not rocket science by any means, but there are specific techniques when it comes to censusing wildlife. It's a sample census, not a total census. And so you should at least get a start by getting some good guidance from people that know how to do it, to set up a spotlight route. If you're in South Texas or West Texas, where the visibility is more open, up in the Panhandle, aerial census, whether fixed wing or helicopter censuses, again, there's a little bit of technique. Where the vegetation is a little bit thicker, in East Texas, the piney woods, camera censusing is becoming more and more popular and used more practically, but there are techniques to it. So you want to be sure that you don't want to be wasting your efforts, time and money and travel and everything else to do these censuses without knowing how that data is going to be used. You don't want to collect a bunch of data that's unusable. So get some good guidance to start with. I'm going to turn it over to Steve. He's going to talk about what they do here specifically, as well as the timing and why the certain times of year that you do the censusing here on the ranch. So,
well, as you explained, in the hill country, one of the most popular survey techniques is a spotlight survey, and that's what we use here on the ranch. Basically, you set up a route, and then you follow that route during the dark hours, preferably just at dark, in the late afternoon and evening hours. And you sample that area. The time of year that we do our spotlight surveys is normally in that September time frame, late August to September. The reason being is the fawns that are alive at that point in time are likely going to survive through to the next year. Also, that gives you that idea of those numbers just before hunting season, so you know what your harvest recommendation, what your recommended harvest can be. Also at that time, your bucks their antlers they may not be hardened horn, they may still be covered in velvet, but their antlers are large, and they're pretty apparent when you see them that they're a buck. So to collect that fawn survival statistic, collect that doe versus buck statistic, just overall number statistics, the best time of year to conduct your surveys. And like Mike said, a spotlight survey is just a form of repeated sampling where you're just sampling a portion of the area and to get an estimated population for that area. And then you can take those numbers and that data and extrapolate to the entire property to get an estimated overall population. Again, so you know how many animals you need to harvest to maintain that acres per deer. For us, here on the Bamberger Ranch, it's about 10 acres per deer. That's our goal.
So is it just a one and done? You count 3 times this year, and you don't ever have to count again?
No, sir. No, sir. You want to count every year, and for your surveys. You want to do at least 3 surveys per year during that September time frame. That way, you get a good average of what you're seeing. Because you may go out one night and just see a plethora of animals, way more animals than is normally there. So doing that survey 3 times during that September time frame gives you a good average, a better representation of the population in that survey area. And then as you go from year to year, and you're not just your survey information, but you're also your harvest data, you see those trends as to what the population is doing, whether or not you're harvesting enough, or whether or not you're harvesting too much, and so on and so forth.
Good. And just because this year may show a deer to 8.73 acres, that you don't know if that's true or not, but if you count next year deer to 9.75 acres, you know, okay, probably the population has been reduced somewhat through your management.
Right.
So it's a trend. You're looking for the trend. I mentioned that getting assistance from professionals to help you set up the spotlight routes, to set up a management plan, to help you collect age, weight, antler data from harvested animals, to analyze that data. Parks and Wildlife, the Wildlife Division biologists, a big part of their time now is spent working with private landowners in addition to their what we call regulatory duties to collect the data to justify harvest recommendations or harvest regulations. They work with private landowners. AgriLife Extension has wildlife specialists, and I'm sure some of the county agents can have some of that expertise. Natural Resource Conservation Service, a lot of the state and federal agencies have staff that can provide assistance to private landowners. I don't want to discount the private consultants out there too. If you as a landowner choose that you want to go the route of hiring a private consultant to help you, that's very good. But I'd say without exception, the assistance that you'd receive from an agency would be no charge or very low charge anyway to do it. And I'm going to say it's just as good as anybody's, that's what we could provide too. The difference between maybe, I'd say, a private consultant and an agency biologist is that an agency biologist is really there to educate you. We'll come out to the property, we'll help you write a management plan, we'll show you how to do that spotlight for the first time, and then it's up to you. We cannot implement anything that we recommend. We can recommend all day long on paper, but it's up to you, the land manager, to implement that stuff. So private consultants can help with implementation in those cases too. You should see on the screen a link that the Natural Resource Institute has put up. I went to it yesterday. It's the agency personnel. I scroll down to the Parks and Wildlife. You can click on the county, and it'll show all the biologists in that county. Blanco County, it'll show all there that can help you. So I really recommend that you go to that. I always recommend when I was working with landowners, just don't rely on me to provide guidance. Talk to AgriLife, talk to NRCS. Hopefully we're all on the same hymn. We may not always sing the same verse all the time, but surely we'll be hopefully on the same hymn when it comes to habitat management and in the management of the population of that wildlife. One of the programs that Parks and Wildlife has, which is exclusive to Parks and Wildlife, because we administered, I keep saying we, but Parks and Wildlife administered, a big part of my life was working under the Managed Lands Deer Permit Program. And I understand that the Selah, participates in the Managed Lands Deer Permit Program.
Yes, sir.
Steve.
Yes, sir. We've been a participant of the MLD program since the 2013-2014 season. We actually had our management plan in the year before, but we needed that 2 years of harvest data to go ahead and qualify for the harvest for the MLD program. The program is great for those landowners that don't have enough hunters or don't want as many hunters out that would be required for them to harvest the numbers they need via their harvest recommendations. Because we can be somewhat limited on tags, right?
Yeah.
That we get our state issued license.
Each hunting license only has 5 whitetail deer tags, and that may not be enough if you don't have enough hunters to accomplish your goals, your management goals on a property sometimes. So, yeah.
That's right. and not every county are you allowed to shoot 5 white-tailed deer. So again,
yeah.
we go back to that annual, the outdoor annual that takes Parks and Wildlife to see those regulations. But the MLD, what it does for us is it allows us to it extends our season.
Extends the
It also
season.
extends the bag limit per person. So basically, if need be, when we thought we were going to get there with COVID this year, but we found a way to work around the pandemic. We thought that we were going to have to harvest every animal that we needed to harvest in-house by just us and the staff members. Thank goodness we don't have to go there. Our hunters are going to be able to join us this season.
But it would have been legal for you
Yes,
as a
sir.
ranch manager and Jared and other staff to harvest all the deer necessary under the Managed Land Deer Permit Program. Again, it's administered by Parks and Wildlife. There's 2 different levels. One's called the harvest option. I think it's been the last 3 or 4 years when these 2 levels settled out. Harvest option doesn't require much from a landowner, but you have to accept whatever harvest recommendation that that Parks and Wildlife makes for the county or part of the county that you're in. But it gives you that extended season and enhanced bag limit. The ranch that here participates in what's called a conservation option, which is more liberal, but you need to have a written management plan. You need to collect census data, you need to collect harvest data, and you have a certain level of habitat management too. So it's just not a matter of Parks and Wildlife throwing a bunch of permits at you. They're looking for something in return for this program, for the benefits that you're
As far
receiving.
as those habitat management practices, they're all practices that a landowner should be undergoing anyway. So it's just a matter of reporting those practices that you're already doing.
And the number of permits that are issued, again, are based on your census data. So you could analyze it and say, hey, Parks and Wildlife, I think this is what I need to kill. Or they can look over your shoulder and either concur with you or say, you might ought to a little bit more or whatever.
I just send in my spotlight survey results, and then they send me harvest recommendations and tags.
And then a big part of it is interpreting after, if you're collecting the age, weight, antler data from the deer that are harvested, you want to interpret that data. Same thing, you're monitoring trends. You're looking at the average weights of 3.5-year-old bucks over time, the average weights of adult does, antler measurements, all in age structure of the population. So that's all important in interpreting data. What I like to do, another way to interpret what's happening on a property is when I would go to a new place that I'd never been on before, and I saw, I could look at the browse species, and browse species throughout the state are rated highly preferred to less preferred when it comes to white-tailed deer. So if you know your plants, you can look and you can see the degree of browsing pressure on the woody plants out there, and you can pretty well tell if a ranch has got a problem with too many browsing animals or the numbers about right or whatever. So even without knowing, you don't know if you have and when I'm talking about browsing animals, white-tailed deer, obviously, a lot of the major exotics are browsers. We don't worry about cattle so much. Sheep, we don't worry about so much. They're more forb eaters, grass eaters, but then goats, domestic goats. So if a property's got goats on it, we don't know if the goats or the wild animals are doing it. But anyway, you can go on a property, you can look at the degree of browsing pressure, and even before you do your first census, you can tell what direction that ranch needs to be going in regard to population management. If you see severe browsing on some of your highly preferred species, and more especially severe browsing on your less preferred species, that's when you got to bring the number down. You want to bring the numbers down to where you start seeing woody growth occurring at that 4.5-foot lower level on those plants, where the animals are not eating every new leaf that comes out. So
I can tell you from experience, it's not easy to hit those goals, those numbers.
Yeah, and I've had an old biologist one time tell me that, especially here in the hill country where we have historically high deer densities, that trying to manage a deer population in central Texas is sometimes an exercise in futility. And you mentioned you try to shoot for a deer to 10 acres. So picture a water trough, a cattle trough that's got a float on it, and that float's going to keep the level of that water at a certain level. Let's say that's the carrying capacity. That's your deer to 10 acres. So through harvest, you're going to dip out 1 cup of deer, 1 cup of water. That water's going to fill up to the level of the carrying capacity again very quickly, probably. No doubt about it. But if you take out a big 5-gallon bucket of water, it's going to take a little bit longer for it to fill up. So even though we know that the deer population is probably going to rebound, especially if you're low fenced, if the habitat is improving through your management, you're going to have higher reproductive rates. Deer from the neighbors are probably going to come in because you got better groceries now. So managing a deer population is not a one and done. Managing population of exotics is not one and done. You've got to keep after it. You cannot, even 1 year lapse is, you got to almost start over again. So it's a continual practice using these
like
tools.
cleaning your house.
Yeah, it's always, yeah. You can't
Now,
stop.
One group that we have out to help us get those numbers late in the season in 1st February is that we've had for the last 5 years a group of youth hunters, and that's through the Texas Youth Hunting Program. Now, Mike, you've worked with the Texas Youth Hunting Program for many years. Tell us a little bit more about the program.
And I want to thank Linda Campbell, who's the hunt master for your hunt here. You know, she's the one that kind of, she's tough, yeah. But
Needs to be.
so the ranch can set the parameters. They can set the time of the hunt. They can set the number of youths. They can even set the sex. You can have all girl, all boy. You can have veteran hunts or kids of veteran hunts or whatever. So you can set the parameters on lodging provided, lodging not provided, meals, yes or no. So a landowner in Texas Youth Hunting Program is a joint effort between Texas Wildlife Association and Texas Parks and Wildlife Program, and it's been in existence probably going on 20 years now. I bet you. I should have looked that up, but it's a program where the Texas Youth Hunting website posts these hunts, and then youth hunters, and they are for youths, I think 17 and younger. I think up until the age where they get old enough to buy an adult license is where they age out of it. But so they can apply very strict safety protocols, like we talked earlier. They all have to come with an adult mentor, with grandparent, parent. They have to, and there's always the children. The hunters are never left alone by themselves. There's always their adult with them. All the hunts are conducted, I think, probably most of them with a guide. The ranch provides the guides or the hunting program, and so we're very selective harvest that occurs. But it's a good way to promote hunting for new hunters coming into the hunting world, which is a very serious concern. I understand the age of hunters keeps getting older and older and older every year. We're just not recruiting those young hunters. So this is a good way to recruit young hunters in an ethical, safe way to do it that way.
Absolutely. I can tell you from experience, sitting with my own children when they harvest their first animal is very, very special. But just as special as sitting with somebody else's child and that parent there when they harvest their first animal. Some of the moments I'll never forget.
Yes.
Now, before I turn it back over to April, I want to say don't forget to send in questions or comments. We're here to answer those. April, take to the home stretch.
Thank you so much, Steve, and thank you, Mike. Thank you, Jared. This has really been a wonderful source of information, and I really appreciate you sharing your knowledge with all of us. Thank you also to the amazing crew, both our team here at Bamberger Ranch Preserve and to the team at the Natural Resources Institute. They're pretty amazing. Thank you, Mike, again, for joining us. I'll echo what Steve just said, to please send in questions. I'll say a few things. We really hope that you'll continue to join us. We have next week where we're talking about the 5th tool that Aldo Leopold championed, and that is the tool of fire. Just a little bit of a review. We've already covered the axe, the cow, the plow. Today we covered the gun and other sort of ways that other tools are used in the same way that a gun is used. These are all different tools, but have the kind of the same impact in terms of our wildlife management that we're so careful about doing here. And I also just want to remind everybody that once we have our programming picked up again after we're on the other side of this pandemic, here at Bamberger Ranch Preserve, we offer landowner workshops and tours that really showcase our habitat management and ecological restoration activities that we've been telling you about virtually here on the property. So I would encourage everybody to check us out, look us up, follow us on Facebook, follow the Natural Resources Institute on Facebook, sign up for our notifications so you know when we're going live, and thank you all very, very much again for joining us today. Now, one question that I would like to ask before signing off for Mike and Steve is if idea that it's a really good thought, which is how does a landowner approach a natural resources conservation professional in terms of inviting them out to their land, inviting them to help in their wildlife management activities? How would a landowner approach a natural resources conservation professional like that?
Yeah.
I would think it'd be pretty easy. Is just find their contact information. Go to that one website that the NRI has put up, where you can get their contact information, but whether it's via email. And I'll tell you from my experience with having those guys out. Depends on the time of year, especially when you're a Texas Parks and Wildlife biologist. This time of year is probably not the easiest time to get them to come out. But if it's in the summer, yeah, they're looking for an excuse to get out of the office.
Yeah, and I can speak for Texas Parks and Wildlife, not necessarily the AgriLife or NRCS, but yeah, just I think exclusively the phone numbers. When you go to the Parks and Wildlife website, you look at your county, the phone number for that biologist should be there. There may even be email addresses for several, but give them a call. Steve's right. There's busy times of the year. This time of year from, say, August all the way up to the beginning of honey season is very busy. Another busy time to keep in mind, too, is after the first of the year, a lot of landowners more and more are going to the wildlife tax valuation for their 1D1 ag valuation. So it's a busy time. But, yeah, just have patience with them. They'll come out and help you. I just want to say that when a Parks and Wildlife biologist comes out to your property, he or she cannot go through your gate without having written permission. They're very strict about, they want that permission from the landowner or landowner's agent to come in there. And then anything that biologist sees on that property is exempt from any kind of freedom of information request. It's a very confidential aspect. Management plans cannot be publicized. The harvest data, census data, it's all very confidential just between the biologist and the landowner. If the landowner wants to share it, it's up to him, but Parks and Wildlife is regulated by law that they cannot share that data. So it's really a safe process when it comes to having somebody come on your property, at least from the state side of things.
I've never had a non-enjoyable visit, whether it's NRCS or forestry agent or Texas Parks and Wildlife. They've always been a pleasure to be around. Like I said, they're excited to get out of the office, so they're normally happy to be out there and full of information that you as a landowner or a land manager needs in your repertoire, so you can pull on that in future times.
The most enjoyable visits I always had were those new to the landowners, people that had never owned a piece of property before, and it's like an open book. They're sponges, plants. You teach them plants and everything, and so old guys that have been around for a while, you're not as much fun as those new to the landowners. You know too much already. We can't help you.
It's because of y'all.
Yeah. Okay. Good.
That's wonderful, Stephen and Mike. Thank you so much. That's great. It's nice to hear you discussing that. So another thing I'd like for you to talk about a little bit is about how browse preferences change across regions of our great state of Texas. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Mike.
Yeah.
You've got more experience with other regions than I have.
Yeah, most of and we'll start here in Central Texas, but most of the woody plant species in Central Texas are deciduous. The exceptions would be ash juniper, cedar, and live oak. I'm trying to think if there's anything else that keeps their leaves. So yeah, it's going to change. So during the winter months, the only green woody browse out there is going to be either live oak or juniper, and you don't want to see deer eating a lot of juniper. If they're eating juniper, you got problems. During the spring of the year when everything's leafing out, there's a lot of different species. Texas red oak is a very highly preferred species, hackberry, cedar elm. So you expect to see more intense browsing on those highly preferred species early in the year. If we have a good wet spring and summer, we have a lot of forb growth, and like I think y'all had some good late summer rains here. I don't know how your spring was, but your late summer, so we got a lot of good forbs growing right now. I think if deer have a druthers, they would rather eat these forbs because they're more digestible, they're more palatable, a lot more diversity. So April, to answer your question, it will change. If you have a dry summer, you're going to see more intensive use of woody browse plants. If you have a wet summer, you may not see much use at all until very, very late in the year. But the weakest link in this whole system is always that winter time when we just don't have many woody plants with leaves on them. And if we have a dry winter, that's a weak link in the whole system right there.
That's when you'll see deer actually chewing on twigs.
Yeah. And the reason why South Texas is different then is, down there they've got a lot of evergreen woody plants, and so the level of nutrition is pretty level plain throughout the year down there, so they don't go through that highs and lows like we experience here in this part of the state. So, yeah, there are regional differences as well as seasonal differences in browse preferences.
Wonderful. Thank you both so much. That's really useful information. And once again, I would just like to thank everybody for tuning in today. Thank you to the wonderful team at Selah Bamberger Ranch Preserve. Thank you to the wonderful team at the Natural Resources Institute. Thank you for our expert commentators. We really appreciate you being willing to join us virtually. Thanks again to Mike Kruger for sharing your amazing experience with us. And we thank all of you for being here in Aldo Leopold's living room. We'll see you next week.